giorni, buonasera a tutti, sono Simeone, direttore dell'Accademia Britannica, director of the British School at Rome. I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening for the lecture which introduces the conference which is going to be held tomorrow at the Accademia Nazionale di San Luca on the subject of dalla corte della Cancelleria, Pietro Ottoboni e la politica delle arti nella Roma del Settecento. The exile court of King James III, I think, is a fascinating kind of micro history, but an incredibly important moment in British history, which doesn't necessarily get the attention that it deserves. So having this event, this conference, and also tonight's lecture is incredibly welcome. And I'm delighted the extent to which the British School of Rome itself is involved in the endeavour through one of our research fellows and indefatigable supporters, Karen Wolfe, and also through the work of Palazzo della Cancelleria from the University of Reggio Calabria, who've helped put this together, ably assisted by Assistant Director Harriet O'Neill. So it's also wonderful to have had a kind of mini exhibition where people have lent things and we've been able to put things in display cases to contextualise and help bring the event, which will also, I understand, there's a mini exhibition going to be at the Accademia di San Luca as well, of other veneziani and other paintings, to accompany proceedings with the objects and the texts, in a sense, to help contextualise it. So, as some of you may know, the exile King James III moved his court to Rome in 1719 and remained there with only one brief interval, right the way through until his death at the beginning of 1766. So it basically means that the Stuart court was based in Rome during the, at least I think it must be about the last 20 years of the life of Cardinal Ottoboni, from what I can remember. The Palazzo della Cancelleria was situated at the north end of the Piazza dei Santi Apostoli and became an important social and cultural centre in the papal city. And King James was recognised by 6 successive popes, so was never recognised at home. He secured recognition, specifically in Italy, as the legitimate or the de jure monarch of the 3 kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland. And consequently, he was given full royal honours, including the privilege of granting cardinals, and the Stuart court was regularly visited by the cardinal president in Rome, notably by Cardinal Ottoboni, as well as by the French, Spanish ambassadors and the Roman princely families. So it was a court of exile. It's also a kind of diplomatic centre of exile, although not formally recognised back in Britain. It had that status within the city. This summer, I went up to the Montefiascone Conservation Centre summer school, where 2 colleagues from the Rare Books Room at the University of Cambridge were teaching book restoration at the seminary there. And we managed to get access to the, I think it's fair to say, deserted palace, Palazzo del Vescovo, opposite the cathedral, where there's this wonderful plaque, which is the room in which James III was married to Queen Clementina. And it's surrounded by abandoned furniture and bats, as it turns out. But not what I was expecting on that particular visit, but very pertinent to today's proceedings. So I'd like to welcome this evening's speaker, Edward Corr, who's curated 2 major exhibitions on the Stuart court in exile at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1992, and also at the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in 2001. His other books include A Court in Exile, The Stuarts in France, 1689-1718, from 2004 with CUP, The Jacobites at Urbino, 2009, which was translated into Italian and published by Mulino in 2013, and The Stuarts in Italy, 1719-1766, which also came out with CUP, Cambridge University Press, in 2011. He was Professor of British History at the Université de Toulouse, but far more importantly, he was a Paul Mellon Fellow at the British School in Rome in 2004-05, and it's our delight this evening to welcome Edward back to give this lecture this evening and launch the conference. So So welcome and thank you, Edward.
Well, thank you for such a nice introduction, and it is indeed very nice to be back, and very nice to see such a large and wonderful audience in front of me. We must remove that. It is appropriate, as we've heard, that a conference devoted to Cardinal Pietro Ottoboni should begin at the British School of Rome, because for the last 20 years of Ottoboni's life, the exiled British King James III was resident in the Papal States, and for most of that time in Rome. King James had been brought up and educated in the French royal chateau at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, previously the principal residence of King Louis XIV, and was personally acquainted with the French cardinals and the French diplomatic representatives in Rome. Indeed, James, although the exiled King of England, was culturally a French prince, and thus had an immediate connection with Ottoboni, who since 1709 had been the cardinal protector of France. James's minister, the papal court, who was the cardinal protector of England, was Filippo Antonio Gualterio, who rented Palazzo Fiano on the Corso from Ottoboni's brother Marco. And it was there that King James lived when, exiled from France, he first arrived in Rome. In the years which followed, Ottoboni and James regularly met each other, not only in Rome, but also at Albano, where Ottoboni had a villa, and where James was given permanent use of the Palazzo Apostolico, previously Palazzo Savelli. Now, before I go on with my talk as a whole, I thought we might immediately look at just one of the many occasions when King James met Cardinal Ottoboni. This painting by Antonio David shows the baptism of James's son Charles in the Chapel Royal of the Stuart Court. On the left, standing behind King James, we can see the cardinal protectors of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Gualterio for England, Giuseppe Sacripanti for Scotland, and Giuseppe Renato Imperiali for Ireland. And they are shown behind Annibale Albani, one of the three nephews of Pope Clement XI. So Gualterio, Sacripanti, Imperiali, and Annibale Albani. On the right, we see four other cardinals, two of whom were the protectors of Spain and France. They are Francesco Acquaviva for Spain, Francesco Barberini, whose great-uncle had been protector of Scotland for 56 years, Fabrizio Paolucci, the Secretary of State, and finally, Pietro Ottoboni for France. And they are standing with King James's friend Don Carlo Albani, Principe di Soriano, one of the other nephews of the Pope. So Acquaviva, Barberini, Paolucci, and Ottoboni, and Don Carlo Albani. And as I think we can see, Ottoboni's portrait has been copied by David from a much earlier portrait by Trevisani of Ottoboni, with which we are now familiar. I think the black and white shows that perfectly clearly. So, I continue with my talk. The Stuart royal family had been living in exile since being deposed by William of Orange at the beginning of 1689. And we know that James III was never going to be restored to the triple monarchy of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But we must remember that people did not know that at the time. particularly in Rome, where it was assumed by many that sooner or later James would recover his thrones, just as his uncle Charles II had in 1660. If only for that reason, James was given full royal honours by Pope Clement XI and his 5 successors, and treated as a legitimate or de jure king of the British kingdoms. Ottoboni and the great majority of the cardinals resident in Rome followed suit, particularly after the Bourbon reconquest of Naples in 1734. And it's important to remember this because the status of monarch did not necessarily depend on the actual de facto possession of territory, as had been shown during the recent residence in Rome of Queen Christina of Sweden. To take just the most obvious examples, the Holy Roman Emperor claimed to be King of Spain. The King of France claimed to be King of Navarre. And the Hanoverian King in London claimed to be King of France. The only difference between James and those monarchs was that he did not have any other territorial base to fall back on, and was therefore obliged to live as an exile in Rome and planned his anticipated restoration from here. When, therefore, James established his court in Rome on a semi-permanent basis in November 1719, exactly 300 years ago this month, the accommodation that he was given was regarded as only provisional. There were at that time 2 adjacent palazzi, both of them known at the time rather confusingly as Palazzo Muti, because each of them belonged to members of the Muti Papazzuri family, who at that time happened to be 3rd cousins. The one at the north end of the Piazza dei Santi Apostoli was rented for James and his court by the Camera Apostolica and renamed the Palazzo del Re, or Palais Royal, or King's Palace. The other one, on the west side of the Piazza Pilota, continued to be occupied by the Muti family, was never occupied by the Stuarts, and therefore continued to be known as the Palazzo Muti, a simplification which was no doubt welcome at the time. By 1724, however, it had become clear that the restoration of the Stuart king was going to take longer than originally expected, and that therefore James would require better accommodation than could be provided by the Palazzo del Re. At first, it was decided that he should be transferred to the Palazzo Riario in Trastevere, where Queen Christina had lived. But that building, unlike the Palazzo in the Piazza dei Santi Apostoli, was regarded as too far away from the Quirinale. So in the end, the Palazzo del Re was substantially rebuilt within to provide greatly improved accommodation. As one of James's courtiers put it when the building works had been completed, our palazzo is now quite another thing than it was. And thus, it was in that building that James and his family continued to live, and to that building that Ottoboni and the other cardinals regularly came to pay court to the king and dine with him. Although James had some other sources of income, he was dependent on the generosity of the successive popes, who provided him with a monthly pension, paid all the money to rent the palazzo from the Muti and then the Sacchetti families, which owned it, and covered the cost of all the maintenance, decoration, repairs and improvements that the building frequently required as the years went by. They also provided Palazzo Apostolico at Albano on the same terms with the king's regular villeggiature. The monthly pension was steadily increased, and on top of that, the popes personally gave James very substantial presents in cash on fairly regular occasions, and this in addition to the monthly pension channeled through the Camera Apostolica. The aim, which was achieved, was to enable King James to maintain an impressive royal court where he could generously entertain. But there was definitely not enough money to finance any naval or military operations to mount a restoration attack. Such operations, it was understood, would depend on the King of Spain or, more probably, the King of France. And that, it was obvious, would depend on an eventual renewal of war between one of those kingdoms, preferably France, and Hanoverian Great Britain. There was no new Anglo-French war until after Ottoboni's death in 1740, and only a relatively minor Anglo-Spanish war in the Caribbean in 1739. So, the 1720s and 30s were in effect a period of waiting. But James had two sons, Prince Charles, who we've seen, born in December 1720, and Henry, born in March 1725, both of them popular in the Papal States and in Italy as a whole. A renewal of the Anglo-French War in the early 1740s, as indeed did happen, would therefore coincide with the young prince's achievement of manhood, so it was hoped in Rome that they would bring about the much anticipated restoration. Meanwhile, as we were told earlier, both the French and Spanish ambassadors in Rome, who became or already were James's personal friends, always gave him full royal honours, despite the official policies of the French and Spanish courts, and much, of course, to the irritation of the government in London. Ottoboni, as Cardinal Protector of France, was therefore closely associated on a regular basis with the French ambassador and the Cardinal Protectors of England, Scotland and Ireland, in showing support for and attempting to further the interests of the exiled Stuarts. Now, to illustrate this, we might take some examples concerning music in the mid and late 1720s. In 1725, it was anticipated that the pro-Hanoverian foreign policy conducted by the court of Versailles was about to change, and that James would be invited to return to France, probably to Saint-Germain-en-Laye, overlooking the river Seine. This coincided with the marriage of Louis XV with the Polish princess Maria Leszczyńska. To celebrate the marriage, and also in anticipation of James's return to France, the French ambassador, Cardinale de Polignac, and Ottoboni commissioned the composition and performance of two serenatas concerning the river Seine. The marriage would be celebrated by Polignac with the serenata entitled Senna, Fama, Amore e Iemeneo by the Venetian composer Francesco Gasparini. The change of French foreign policy would then be celebrated by Ottoboni with another work referring to the river Seine, and specifically James's return to Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Entitled La Senna Festeggiante, this serenata was by another Venetian composer, Antonio Vivaldi. Well, Louis XV did get married, so the serenata by Gasparini was performed at the French embassy. But French foreign policy did not change, so Ottoboni cancelled the performance of the serenata by Vivaldi. In the following year, however, Ottoboni made his triumphant return to Venice and invited James to join him there. In the event, the Doge and the Great Council informed Ottoboni that the presence of James would not be welcome, because the Republic recognized the Hanoverian king in London. So Ottoboni went to Venice without James. 3 years later, in the carnival season of 1729-30, Polignac and Ottoboni decided to celebrate the birth of the Dauphin in France, and again commissioned new musical compositions. This time, Polignac commissioned a serenata by Leonardo da Vinci, and Ottoboni commissioned an opera by Giovanni Costanzi, whom I shall be mentioning again later. When the former was performed at the French embassy, Polignac had a box specially constructed in the position of honour to be occupied by King James and his entourage. When the latter was performed in the theatre of the Palazzo della Cancelleria, Ottoboni went further and gave to James all the keys to the boxes in the theatre so that he could personally invite the people he wanted to the performance. When assessing the musical patronage of Cardinal Ottoboni, it's useful to remember that during the last 20 years of his life, he was an active supporter of the exiled King of England, whose rank in Rome was second only to that of the Pope. Now, of course, James had to be careful to behave with moderation and not to put too much emphasis on his royal status. His position was delicate, and he had to cultivate and maintain the willing support of the cardinals and the Roman princely families. It was at performances of music, and particularly of opera, that James's royal status was most apparent, because he enjoyed two privileges denied to others. No performance that he was expected to attend could start before his arrival, and once in his box he was permitted to have a meal. In January 1726, to illustrate this point, it was noted by a German in Rome that the overture had already been played when an order was received from the officer of the guard that we should not start until the king had arrived. James later had supper in his box during the second act, a prerogative accorded to him alone, and otherwise prohibited to all. Many documents have survived showing that Ottoboni was often invited to King James in his box and shared these privileges, particularly, but not only, in the Teatro Aliberti. Now, Ottoboni himself mainly patronized the Teatro Capranica. So, I'll take an example of what an English visitor to that opera house noted in February 1721. It concerns a performance of Alessandro Scarlatti's Griselda, which was in fact the composer's last opera. Went this day to the theatre of Capranica, where we saw the opera of Griselda, played without any life or action, the song sung so low as to be hardly heard, the whole received without any extraordinary marks of satisfaction from the audience. But then, as soon as King James and his spouse entered the front box, the curtain was drawn up and the music started properly. I could not but observe the respect paid to the king and his spouse, so that the opera began on their entry and the curtain was let down on their exit, which I think assumes they didn't stage at the end of the performance. Well, in this particular case, the opera, or as we would say, the libretto of the opera, was not dedicated to James or his wife, Queen Clementina, but at the Teatro Aliberti from 1720 to 26, every opera performed there was dedicated either to James or to Clementina, and at least one of them actually had its dress rehearsal before an invited audience within the Palazzo del Re. Thereafter, the new operas were dedicated less frequently to the Stuarts, but as late as 1739 and 1740, the last carnival seasons before Ottoboni died, there were operas dedicated to James and both his two sons in the Teatro Aliberti and the new Teatro Argentina. Another royal privilege enjoyed by James concerned the allocation of opera boxes, particularly on formal or state occasions, because monarchs, well, or rather the ambassadors of monarchs, were allocated boxes by right. Thus, for example, the ambassador of the King of Spain was automatically given the box. The ambassador of the Holy Roman Emperor, by contrast, was given two boxes. One in his capacity representing the emperor, and the second because the emperor claimed to be King of Spain. James, of course, was not just an ambassador, but the king himself, in person, and moreover the legitimate monarch of 3 kingdoms. So he was given 3 boxes. Fortunately for us, we have a large painting by Giovanni Paolo Panini which provides visual testimony of this. It is the famous painting now in the Louvre, showing a performance in the Teatro Argentina in July 1747 of a serenata by Niccolò Jomelli. Both the performance and the painting were commissioned by the French ambassador, Cardinale de la Rochefoucauld, and James could be seen on the right-hand side in the triple box that he was given as King of England, Scotland and Ireland. James, of course, is there wearing the garter with his chair clearly visible both sides of the hill. But perhaps, if you're not too close, that might give you a slightly better idea again. There it is. James's royal status also manifested itself in other ways, notably in the frequency with which he was received in private audience by the successive popes, and in the positions of honour that he was always given during formal papal ceremonies. He also enjoyed, along with the other reigning European monarchs, the privilege of nominating cardinals. The prelates that he selected were French or Italian. In fact, 5 Frenchmen and 2 Italians were nominated by him. But he also nominated his younger son, Prince Henry, Duke of York. And this was significant because monarchs were only permitted to nominate 1 cardinal at a time and had to wait for that cardinal to die before they could nominate another one. Yet on 2 occasions, James was allowed to nominate a cardinal, including his own son, before the death of the previous nominee. The French Foreign Minister, le Marquis d'Argenson, commented in his diary in 1739, after the nomination by James of Cardinal de Tencin. How has it come about that a claimant to the throne has 2 cardinalships in his giving, whereas actual monarchs have only 1? And the answer in part was because James was popular in Rome, did not push his royal status too far, and established very good relations with both Pope Clement XII and Benedict XIV. Clement XII showed James a particular favour in the winter of 1733-4, when he decided that the Palazzo del Re should thenceforth be provided with a papal guard. 4 Swiss guards were ordered to protect the royal apartments within the palazzo, and 20 soldiers were sent every evening to clear all the streets surrounding the building and prevent unauthorized people entering either the Piazza dei Santi Apostoli or the Piazza Pilato. The ground floor of the adjacent Palazzo Muti was then commandeered by the Pope to serve as a barracks for a detachment of soldiers, some of whom were to accompany the king and his sons whenever they wanted. A French visitor noted in 1739 that the Pope's troops mount the guard at the King's Palace, as they do at the Cardinale, and accompany him when he goes out. This arrangement was particularly useful during the years until 1740, the last 6 years of the life of Ottoboni, when the French ambassador was one of James's childhood friends. Now, the French embassy had previously been located elsewhere, but the new ambassador, the Duc de Saint-Aignan, decided to rent Palazzo Bonelli because it was at the south end of the Piazza dei Santi Apostoli, immediately opposite the Palazzo del Re. With the piazza and the adjoining streets closed off by the Scuoli, James, Saint-Aignan, Ottoboni, and the other cardinals as well as visiting British and Irish grand tourists who supported the Stuarts, could move freely between the two buildings without being observed by the common people of Rome or by Hanoverian spies. Another privilege enjoyed by James was the right to employ Protestant chaplains at his court and to authorize Protestants, specifically Anglican services, to be held within it. In addition, it was at James's request that Pope Clement XI had agreed that a Protestant cemetery should be opened beside the Pyramid of Cestius for the burial of his courtiers, servants, and visitors. Now this was important because James, although personally a Catholic, was king of two countries, England and Scotland, which were both Protestant. The Stuarts, after all, were only in exile because they were Catholic. And James was not prepared to effect a fake conversion in order to recover his thrones. It was essential, therefore, that he should be seen to be in favour of complete religious toleration. And there was no better way to show that than by employing Protestants, including Anglican chaplains, at his court. But he went further than that and employed a succession of Protestants as his secretaries of state. He also employed a Protestant to be the governor of his two sons, Charles and Henry, when he considered them old enough to be removed from the Caribbean. Their tutors were all Catholic to provide them with a proper Catholic education, but their governor was Protestant to instill in them their father's support for religious toleration. James, of course, assumed that his own rigid devotion to the Catholic Church, at very great personal cost, would absolve him from any suspicion of wanting to bring up his children as heretics. But he had not counted on the opposition of his wife, which resulted in a major crisis which divided Roman opinion. James's wife, Queen Clementina, who, we've been told, was married at Montefiascone in September 1719, and with whom he settled here in Rome in November of that year, was a daughter of Prince James Sobieski, the eldest son of King John III of Poland, of course, the saviour of Vienna in 1683. She was a devout Catholic, and when she arrived at the Stuart court, she was only 17 years old. Despite her youth, however, she was regarded as a potential threat by the leading Protestants who she met there. And because she was so young, they treated her with little respect and persuaded the king, who was 14 years older than her, to deny her a separate household or any independent authority within the court. As a result, she quickly began to hate and despise her husband's Protestant courtiers. 6 years later, by 1725, she was the mother of two sons and no longer an immature teenage girl. And the relations between her and the leading Protestants had reached breaking point. Matters came to a head when one of the Protestants, whom she absolutely loathed, was appointed to be the governor of her elder son Charles, and given instructions that she should no longer be allowed to see her own son, except in his presence. Well, presumably to stop her indoctrinating the boy against Protestants and Protestantism. So she left the court and took refuge at the convent of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere, refusing to return until the leading Protestants had been dismissed and sent away. She knew that public opinion in Rome was likely to support her husband on the grounds that, as a man, he should have control over his own family and household. So, she allowed it to be understood that James was trying to bring up her son as a Protestant. And that her husband was even having an affair with the Protestant wife of his Protestant Secretary of State. Now, although these allegations were completely false, they so impressed Pope Benedict XIII, the strict Dominican, that he intervened on her side, and it was these arguments that persuaded many people in Rome, but not Ottoboni, to support her against her husband. The Pope put pressure on James by reducing his pension, and then by giving half of his remaining pension to Clementina. James, in response, left Rome and moved his court to Bologna, where he rented Palazzo Fantuzzi and the adjacent Palazzo Cospi, and Clementina did not rejoin him there until a year later, after a compromise, or a kind of compromise, settlement had been reached. It was, of course, while James was at Bologna that he was invited by Ottoboni to join him during his triumphant return to Venice, and that the Doge told Ottoboni that James would not be welcome. Well, James, Clementina, and their two sons returned to Rome to live in the Palazzo del Re at the beginning of 1729. And the following year, Pope Clement XII made it clear that he completely supported the king in his decision to give his two sons a Protestant governor. Clementina withdrew from society, shut herself away in her apartment for most of the time, and totally dedicated herself to her religious devotions. She also became anorexic and died in January 1735, when still only 32 years old. But the saintly life that she lived during her final years so impressed contemporaries that the monument to her memory, which can still be seen in St. Peter's, was erected a few years later. Well, the 1730s, that is, the last 10 years of Ottoboni's life, when the two Stuart princes were growing up, were in a sense the apogee of the Stuart court in Rome. It was also the time when, judging by the available documentary evidence, the friendship between Ottoboni and King James was at its closest. We do have evidence of their good relations earlier, during the 1720s. For example, the library of the British School of Rome contains the diary of one of Prince Charles's tutors, Diego de Revillas, which is actually on display outside, and it records that on one occasion, James took Ottoboni to see the scientific instruments in the house that Revillas had on the Aventine Hill. But we know much more about their relations during the 1730s, and the evidence we have particularly concerns music, as usual. King James, Ottoboni, and the Duke de Sant'Enio would organise magnificent concerts in Rome, featuring in particular the music of Giovanni Costanzi, and invite each other to attend them. Or Ottoboni would invite James and his sons to concerts at his bishopric at Porto, where he erected a marble monument at the gate of the city in James's honour. Ottoboni's last important concerts took place in the Palazzo della Cancelleria during the summer of 1739, where the Stuarts were his principal guests, for a performance of all 150 songs, newly set to music with orchestral accompaniment. 30 songs performed on each occasion in a series of 5 concerts, attended by the Stuarts, spread over 2 months. The composer of those new settings of the Psalms was Giovanni Battista Martini, but the principal composer employed by Ottoboni at the end of his life was Costanzi, who had entered the Cardinals' service in 1721, and whose opera for the birth of the Dauphin in 1729 I've already referred to. As well as being a composer, Costanzi was the leading performer in Rome on the cello. And during the 1730s and early 1740s, was employed by King James to organise his concerts in the Palazzo del Re and to teach the cello to his son, Prince Charles. When Ottoboni died in 1740, Costanzi formally entered the service of the Stuarts, worked for King James and his son, Prince Henry, became a member of the Stuart royal household, and took up residence within the Palazzo del Re. This, as far as I know, is a fact which has been totally overlooked by musicologists, but its discovery implies that Vivaldi's cello sonatas, of which the manuscript almost certainly belonged to Ottoboni, were written for Costanzi and played by him at the Stuart court. And it was the concerts which were organised by Costanzi at the Stuart court in 1739 and 1740, featuring music by Corelli, Scarlatti, Vinci and Vivaldi, among others, which were described by Charles de Brosse as providing the best music in Rome. Music was not the only art form where there was an overlap between the patronage of Cardinal Ottoboni and King James, because the latter and some of his courtiers employed Francesco Trevisani, who was patronised by Ottoboni and lived in the Palazzo della Cancelleria, to point their portraits. There were several reasons for this, of which the most important was that James had recently been painted by Antonio David, so was looking for a different portrait painter. At the beginning of 1719, therefore, when he was in Rome briefly for 6 weeks, James had Trevisani paint him as King of England, wearing his formal robes as the sovereign head of the Order of the Garter. We see him with the collar of the Garter and put great George at the Garter. And when Clementina arrived in Rome a few months later, she also was painted by Trevisani, showing her as Queen of England. And that, of course, is something that you've been able to see outside before coming in here. Ottoboni, who probably saw these two portraits before they were even finished, immediately commissioned Trevisani to produce replicas, which he then displayed in the Palazzo della Cancelleria. In the years which followed, and during the lifetime of Ottoboni, King James commissioned a great many portraits of himself, his wife Clementina, and his sons Charles and Henry. In Rome, from Girolamo Pesci, Antonio David, Martin van Meitens, Agostino Mazzucchi, Jean-Étienne Lyotard, and Louis-Gabriel Blanchet. In Bologna, from Lucia Casalini Torelli and Giovanna Fratellini. And in Venice, from Rosalba Carriera. After Ottoboni's death in 1740, James commissioned further portraits from Domenico Duprat, Etienne Paracel, and Anton Raphael Mengs. By my calculation, and leaving aside the hundreds of replicas and original copies, about 40 different Stuart portraits were commissioned in Italy by James during the lifetime of Ottoboni, most of which the Cardinal would have seen. Trevisani, who of course was not primarily a portrait painter, never painted the Stuarts again. But he did paint the leading Protestants at the Stuart court, including the man who became the governor of Prince Charles, the wife of the Secretary of State falsely accused of having an affair with the king, and also the Secretary of State himself. The many portraits that we have of the exiled Stuarts provide useful evidence of how King James wished he himself, his wife and children to be represented. It was painted by Alexis Simondel in France in 1712. Previously, when he had lived in France and Lorraine, during the lifetime of his half-sister Anne, the de facto Queen in London, he had always had himself shown as a knight of the English Order of the Garter, but never with a closed crown, the symbol of kingship. Nor had he been shown as a knight of the Scottish Order of the Thistle, as the Thistle insignia had been regarded as incompatible with those of the Garter, and James always stressed that he was primarily English. This, however, changed after the death of Queen Anne of the Hanoverian succession, followed by an unsuccessful rising in his favour in Scotland. From then onwards, when he was first painted in Rome by Antonio David, James sometimes instructed his portrait painters to show him with a closed crown, and always told him to include the insignia of the Order of the Thistle. That's right. That's it. Yeah. Antonio David, Rome, 1717. And there we have the closed crown, and in addition to the garter, we now have the thistle. The St. George medal of the garter was attached to a blue cordon falling from his left shoulder to his right hip. And the St. Andrew medal of the thistle was suspended from a green ribbon worn around his neck. Like you can see in the bust copy rather more easily. This method of wearing the two orders simultaneously was modelled on what the Bourbons had done with the Saint-Esprit and the Toison d'Or after the Duc d'Anjou had succeeded to the throne of Spain in 1700. And when James's two sons were old enough, they were also shown with both the English and Scottish chivalric orders worn in this way. Queen Clementina, of course, was not eligible as a woman to be a knight of these orders, but she was sometimes shown with a closed crown. Durand de Pesci, 1721. Both of those, in this case, the closed crown. And that's, of course, and the baby is, of course, Charles. And in her most famous portrait, painted by Martin van Muytens in 1725, this is the one reproduced in mosaic with St. Peter's, she has a blue ribbon falling in the opposite direction. These and the other portraits were reproduced in multiple copies to be circulated to the courts of Europe, to James's supporters among the Cardinals, and to his loyal British and Irish subjects living in exile or within the British kingdom. Inside the Palazzo del Re itself, James also displayed several large state portraits, which were not copied and could only be seen by Ottoboni and the other cardinals when they visited him in his apartment overlooking the Via di San Marcello and the Piazza dei Santi Apostoli. These portraits are also interesting because of the evidence they contain concerning the closed crown. The portraits of James from 1717 to 1722, when he was anticipating that he would soon be restored, include a crown placed beside him on a table. These are the ones by Antonio David and Francesco Trevisan. But it's only in the portrait by David of 1722 that his hand is actually placed on the crown. And I can't help observing that the crown is somewhat different. This was because 1722 was the year of the so-called Atterbury plot, when James was most confident of being restored. Thereafter, when he could no longer anticipate an imminent restoration, he was no longer shown with a crown. The portraits of Queen Clementina tell a slightly different story. When she was painted by Trevisani in 1719, James was at that time in Spain, preparing to join an expeditionary force to go and invade England. In his absence, and in anticipation of a restoration, the painter was instructed to place Clementina's hand on the crown. Thereafter, and up to 1722, the Queen was given a crown in her portraits, but her hand was no longer placed on it. And when William Mossman went to the Palazzo del Re in 1733 to make a copy of this portrait by Trevisani, he was instructed to take her hand off the crown. Of course, it's not such a good portrait, but he's also trying to make a look bit older. The only portrait which Clementina is known herself to have commissioned, which was by David in 1726, when she was living an austere life in the convent in Trastevere, has a crown prominently displayed beside her, but her hands hold a crown. We may also observe that James ordered that a crown should be placed beside her in her last portrait, painted posthumously by Agostino Masucci, when a process had been started towards her possible beatification. Though the painting is lost, we only know it from the engraving, which again has been shown in the exhibition outside. Well, that's enough from me. In the main part of our conference tomorrow, we shall hear many papers concerning the artistic, architectural, literary and musical passion of Cardinal Pietro Ottoboni. I cannot obviously predict what those papers will contain, but I am not expecting them to say very much about King James and the Stuart court, and probably very few will even mention them at all. The speakers concentrating on the years before 1719, before James took up residence in Rome, that's of course hardly surprising. But I believe, and I hope that you would agree, that it's useful to be aware and to remember, as the conference tomorrow proceeds, that during the last 20 years of his life, while he was busy with his patronage of artists, architects, writers and musicians, Ottoboni was both personally and politically close to the exiled British king, and that king's status in Rome was second only to that of the Pope. And it's for this reason that I'm pleased, very pleased, to have been able to address you this evening here in the British School at Rome.
Thank you very much, Edward, for a fantastically precise and comprehensive talk, which I think raises many questions. We don't make noise. So are there any questions? I think Harry's got a roving microphone from the audience. I think raises many questions. So are there Harry's got a roving microphone?
Hi, could you say something about why James was exiled from France before he came to Rome?
Oh yes, certainly. The French had supported James during the War of Spanish Succession, from 1701 to 1731. And essentially France had been in the War of Spanish Succession, and England and its allies Spanish successful. And one of the terms of the peace treaty on Utrecht in 1713 was that James should be exiled from France. He first of all went to Lorraine, and then after the failure of the Jacobite risings in Scotland in 1715-16, pressure was put on the Duc de Lorraine to push him further, and so he goes off down to the Papal France. First of all, and then pressure is put on the Pope to move him out of Avignon, and he ends up in the Papal States. Pressure is put on the Duc de Lorraine to push him further, and so he goes off down to the Papal France. First,
Thank you, Edward. The painting which had his hand on the closed crown.
Yes. I was hoping someone would raise that.
Well, no, I just wanted to ask you, the city in the background isn't Rome, it's meant to be London?
It is London, yes, it is London. And I think the other earlier one was also London.
Okay. So they're very sort of
yes, exactly. At a time when the hopes really were up.
Yes.
In both occasions, particularly 1722, this was the moment well, things go wrong.
Yes. Okay.
At a time when the hopes really were up.
Yes.
What was the relationship between the James III court and the Veteran Religious College?
Close relations. Oh yes, I'm not sure that I can go into details on that, but they were obviously regularly in touch. They celebrated his birthday and things of that sort, the Restoration Day. You might well go there for the celebration of Stuarts. Yeah, so close relations with the English. No, I mean, of course, they get their paintings and they still have some, as I'm sure you probably know. Yeah, but not James. Certainly have they come in York. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Could you say something about the young pretender, Charles, and his upbringing in Rome, and if the influence of the Rome court, and how, if there's any sort of connection in what happened in 1745 and Bonnet's journey in Rome, landing in Scotland, and the influence that he had in his young life in Rome?
Well, it was connection. Then what happens is a good education. He was brought up as a sort of Italian Scotland, very conscious of being English. During the 1720s as a boy, and for much of the 1730s, he was basically pro-English and not very interested in Scots. This was partly because these Protestants, like during the 1720s, who made his mother's life so difficult. I never said it, but they were all Scotch, basically. And therefore, he, as a young boy, had this rather anti-Scottish feeling. But then this changes at the end of the 1730s when he's given gifts by the then Duke of Perth, his brother, a sword, Highland weapons, and even a tartan suit, which he begins to wear at some of the balls in Rome. And so there's a sudden change in his attitude there, and he becomes very Scottish in the late 1730s. He has a good all-round education. He's very keen on hunting and military things. He never learns to write properly. And his handwriting is appalling, and his English and other languages are bad. That's, I think, part of what I could say. And he believed in religious toleration and was given a Catholic education.
That wasn't it.
Thank you very much for the lecture. You mentioned Isolde as the subject of one of the operas, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little about the subjects of the other operas that were commissioned, partly because opera in the 18th century so often mentioned it with Isolde points.
Right, I can't in detail, but if you, I mean, I have not done this myself, but others have. If you study the libretti of these operas, what are they about? They are very often about dethroned monarchs and who deserve to be restored and will be restored. That is very much the content of the libretti. I can't go into more details on that. I just don't the tone. But the interesting thing about that is that that being the case, that in very these operas, it's the libretti, the content, they go around Europe. And of course, very often they are then set by hand and night, which is interesting to what extent that is significant, I don't know. But during the 1720s into the 30s, candle sets what had been done in Rome for the Stuarts, dethroned monarchs who deserve to be and will be restored. To what extent that is significant, I don't know.
Any questions? I have the one in front.
Candle sets what had been done in Rome for the Stuarts, dethroned.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. What interests me is you've been talking a lot about ceremonies and about the ceremonial context in which the king and his entourage functioned. But if I'm correct in interpreting what you've been saying, most of what you have been discussing were ceremonies in a kind of semi-public space, or ceremonial context in which the king and his entourage functioned. But if I'm correct in interpreting what you've been saying, most of what you have been discussing were ceremonies in a kind of semi-public space, or within the palaces,
yes.
so not in the more, say, public context of Rome. And one of the questions I had is, what can you say about, say, the Roman context of ceremony and the Roman rules of ceremony in the public space, and the kind of ceremonial background that the stewards themselves had? I mean, is there anything like a negotiation of how these ceremonies work, and what is acceptable for the Roman context of what the steward ceremony is, and vice versa?
Yeah, no, I'm sure we will all agree that is a very important question, and it's not something I feel competent to answer, I'm afraid. Possibly because I haven't done the right research, or possibly because the documents simply aren't giving you that information. I mean, they may well, perhaps I've not seen the right ones. Sorry to give a totally blank answer to an important question. No.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is papal master of ceremony, for example. And maybe, I mean, I would expect that depending on who was responsible for the ceremony of steward court, that person must have written down something, I guess. But this is, I mean, I don't know about that kind of sources. But
yeah, it's certainly not survived in the British sources, which is essentially the Stuart papers, which are in England.
But then I would say maybe the papal master of ceremony.
It may well be, yes, exactly, indeed, surely. There would be in there, which I have not seen, and so I can't answer. But of course, that is something to be pursued. I quite agree with you. Yeah, it's a gap in what I've been saying. Yeah.
I was just wondering, does his exile do anything interesting to kind of political readings of kingship? Do definitions of kingship change with a king being in exile in terms of political thought, and what were did the duties of being king shift and change being in exile, or his ability to function as king?
I don't feel I can answer that either. I mean, James needed to be on easy, friendly terms with the people he met. And therefore I think that whereas they would show him respect, etc., that he had to be friendly with them and eat with them and go to their palaces and invite them back. So I don't really know. I mean, one of the things that James is putting out on a political front is, I believe in religious toleration. I thoroughly support the Restoration Settlement of 1689 onward. None of this would change. I'm not sure about the Union of England and Scotland, but that we can consider. But that's not really answering your question. No, that's all quite all I can do. Sorry.
Any more questions?
Can I ask one last one? There's one.
Yeah.
How were the images trafficked? I mean, were they being? How did they get back to Britain? How did that copying process and the actual trafficking? Were they all generated in Rome, or they're being reproduced in
as far as I know, they're being generated in Rome. Some were sent to France to be copied by Alexis de Montagne, who had been the principal painter before they came to Rome. They had to be of size, of course, which could be transported, so most of these portraits are busts. Consequently, most of them don't have a crown because there'd be no space for one anyway. And I suppose the big thing is they are then given as gifts, sent off, normally without a frame. And then they would be engraved. And the best engravings were done in Paris, and so they would be sent there, and the vast numbers of engravings circulated. So that, I think, is what I can say.
We've got one more question back there.
Yeah, you mentioned that James III had the privilege to appoint cardinals.
Yes, I
when Henry became a cardinal his second son, was that his father's prerogative? Or?
Well, that has been agreed. James always had the view that if a restoration hadn't been achieved by a certain moment, it would be too late. He would never be restored. The Stuarts would never be restored. And in his opinion, that time was in the 1740s. You know, and a war with France broke out. The people of England and Scotland were beginning to forget the the Stuarts, it's a long time ago, they had natural allegiance to George II by then, and the new set up. And it was going to be too late. And, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought there.
Yes, so did Cardinal Henry Stuart become a cardinal because his father tapped in for it?
So, at the beginning of the 1730s, James made an arrangement with Pope Clement XII that, if necessary, could he have Henry made a cardinal. Of course, Clement XII would have died by then, but the arrangement was made, and it was also fixed that he would begin to get ecclesiastical revenues from the early 1730s. Now, James's relations with Benedict XIV were even better than with Clement XII. And the moment of the 1745 rising failed, and Prince Charles had been defeated at Rome, as far as James was concerned, that's it. There's no point going on. Let's be realistic. We are not going to be restored. And at that moment, he goes to Pope Benedict and says, okay, I know that I may not, I shouldn't be asking for another cardinal at this moment, but would you please nominate Henry? And Benedict immediately agrees to do so. It had all been fixed in advance.
Thank you.
Is there anyone waiting? Last question, yeah? Final question.
Thank you very much. Wonderful lecture, a revelation in many ways. A question about, you mentioned that one of the operas associated with Ottoboni was on the theme of Griselda.
Yes, I did.
Wasn't it? I remember that reminded me of Vivaldi's opera in the same, story.
Which is mid-1730s.
Yes, 1730s. And now, could there have been any connection between Clementina's life and couldn't perhaps the opera Griselda resonate somehow with the fate of Clementina? There is this coincidence that Vivaldi staged his opera in the same year that Clementina dies, 1735.
True, absolutely. I don't know. I mean, I have always assumed that it was merely a libretto going round, and sooner or later Vivaldi would set it. But that's a very interesting, thought-provoking idea. I suspect not, actually. Vivaldi is no longer in Rome. So it's worth pursuing. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank everybody for coming, but most of all, we thank you for starting off the proceedings, which will continue tomorrow. It's a great start, invite you. I wish everybody well at the conference there. I'm sorry I can't be with you because I'm in London. But thank you so much for coming back to the VSR. It's a pleasure to have you here again. Thank you so much also to Baron for bringing some of the materials through which we made on show, and can we invite everybody upstairs to join